with Energion Publications, and I'm talking today with Dr. Thomas Hudgins. Uh, Thomas has his a Doctor of Education from Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary, and also I actually forget the official title of your PhD from
Greek
the
philology.
Universidad Complutense. Pardon?
Yeah. Greek philology.
Greek philology. That's a good line. Philology we don't use in this country all that much. But in any case, Thomas is co-author with Dr. Antonio Pinero of the book A Story of Jesus' Life According to the Apocryphal Gospels. And there's plenty of questions right there in the title. So I'm going to start out, Thomas, with this. What do you mean by the Apocryphal Gospels?
Yeah. So great question. But imagine that everybody who watches this is probably going to be familiar with something called Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, right? And those are the four gospels that show up in our New Testaments. Maybe they realize it, maybe they don't, but those gospels are by and large focused on the last week of Jesus's life. That's it. Every single one of them is focused on that. John is in fact focused. I mean, when you think about John 13, it goes all the way to John 21 as far as chapters go, but John 13 begins technically the last 24 hours surrounding the crucifixion. So he's focused on a very different section of Jesus's last week, the last night, the Passover, and what comes the day following. Um, Anyways, that's where the focus is. When we talk about apocryphal gospels, we're talking about after the composition of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, there began to be questions that arose, and people decided to write some stories about maybe what Jesus might have been like prior to the age of 30. Um, and those are called his infancy gospels. We'll come back to that, I'm sure. And then some people tried to fill in some different gaps in his life, and created some stories regarding his ministry, the 3 years on earth, while he was, kind of covering the same time period as Matthew through John. But why are they called apocryphal gospels? If you ask Antonio Pinero, he would say that they were systematically hidden from the church, that they were they were written, and the church had an agenda to isolate those texts and keep them out of common knowledge for followers of the Christian faith. Um, Maybe to some extent they were systematically hidden, but the point is they weren't adopted by Orthodox Christianity. And so there was a debate very early on in the centuries, following the 4th and 5th century. There was a debate about which text actually presented Jesus as he lived, and which ones met the criteria for being authoritative, for example, being written by or connected to an apostle. And that's tied to, inspiration as well, whether they were inspired by God, or whether they were works of fiction. So they began these gospels that were not in acceptance and used by Christian communities, churches throughout the known world. Guess what happened? They began to debate whether they should be in practice and whether they should be used as instructing us on who the Jesus who lived actually was like. And there's actually a lot more than 4 that were written. There's a lot, actually. And one thing I just say real fast, Henry, I don't even know what the next question is, but one thing I'll say too is that those gospels that are not in our Bibles, not Matthew, not Mark, not Luke, not John, those other gospels have influenced Christianity in more ways than you even recognize, than your readers recognize, more ways than they can imagine. And I'm sure we'll touch on that here in a second too.
First, just a quick comment question, which is, I would guess that you could have a kind of a chicken and egg situation with the concealment of the Apocryphal Gospels, which is if they were not chosen as official and the four Gospels are maintained by the church, it wouldn't require a great deal of suppression to mean that there were a lot less copies of the ones that were not officially sanctioned for use in church. That seems to be a natural result. Is that a reasonable?
Great question. There is no question that they were being used in Christian communities, faith communities, as if some of them were authoritative. There's no question. And there's probably more of an argument to be made that they were in some ways being followed, not like a work of fiction, but as a work of reality in certain communities than than what than what we give credit to when we talk about them a lot in scholarly circles. But I think they were. I think the reason the church responded to many of them in a suppressive kind of way was because they were being followed. Great question.
Okay, now that leads me to the question, since there's quite a number of these and a variety of manuscripts and so on to deal with, what is it particular that you and Dr. Pinero together bring to the task of presenting these Gospels? We've introduced you, but we don't know Dr. Pinero that well yet.
No. Antonio Pinero is probably the most famous New Testament scholar in the Spanish-speaking world. And he is also not a believer in the sense that he does not believe in the gospel that Jesus died on the cross for our sins and that he has entrusted his his salvation and forgiveness from God by faith. That is far from Antonio Pinero right now. He's not a Christian, right? He would present himself as an agnostic and a skeptic. That he approaches all historical texts the exact same way. By the way, I do too, as a historian. Uh, and he approaches them skeptically because he says they need to be placed under the microscope to be evaluated. And I think that's great. And I think that's probably where we come together is that we want to treat historical text, just text of history is what I mean, texts that have been written. We want to treat them the exact same way. We want to assess them and think about them scientifically. And, our faith doesn't necessarily, uh, it doesn't have to have a bearing on what we think about those texts. We can find a lot of common ground. So I'm a Christian, Antonio is not. Antonio is an agnostic. I'm not an agnostic. Antonio believes that the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the ones that are in our New Testament, are the ones that contain the historical record of what the Jesus of history was like. Does he ascribe to everything as being accurate historically? No, I do. And we kind of walk tandem on some issues, and we are walking, he's in Madrid and I'm in the United States, and there is a space between us, not just geographically, and it's not just an ocean, but when it comes to our faith, and we're in those regards, we're very different. I think And so who's Antonio Pinero? He's the most, I mean, I feel comfortable saying he's the most famous New Testament scholar in the Spanish speaking world. If your readers are familiar with Bart Ehrman in the United States, well, Antonio Pinero would be very similar to Bart Ehrman in the Spanish speaking world.
Okay, so you, in producing this book, well, you've probably had a lot of methodological similarity. You also, by coming with different assumptions, really give an extra critical look at the text because you look at it at the materials because you each have come from a different direction, while agreeing that you need to look critically at the material. Is that a fair summation?
I think, yeah, I mean, Antonio Pinero was hugely influential in my life as far as forming the basis for thinking about text of history and how to evaluate them. Um, we just have we're just different in the conclusions we come to, which evidence we think is stronger. You know, I don't come to the text and believe in miracles because I want to believe in miracles. I think there's a rational argumentation that miracles happen. I don't think it's just a faith. You know, I place my faith. I hope that miracles are real. I think if there's a God and he engages, I think it's more rational that he would engage his creation than not engage his creation. That's why I'm not a deist. I think it's more rational that if he engages his creation, that he would what? Do things that don't limit him or place himself under the constraints of natural laws. He has plenty of he certainly can function in that realm, but I think it's reasonable to say that if he engaged creation, he would what? He would supersede those natural laws and he would reveal himself in certain ways. And I think that's what we see with miracles. So I mean, it's not, you know, I don't want to contrast me as being a person who, you know, has faith. You know, I think faith and reason go hand in hand in tandem. And I think Antonio would agree too that there's faith and reason and he is assessing historical text and looking for rational arguments and assessing strengths and weaknesses of various arguments. And he's coming to a different conclusion based on that evidence. But we're both looking at the same evidence. We're both looking at the same argumentation. We're just being persuaded different ways.
Okay, let's move forward now that we have your background. I like the term Greek philology because it's not used here. Philology is such a nice, broad
Yeah.
kind of look and sometimes messy. So, looking at these texts, what is the value for a Christian today or anybody who's interested in the New Testament period in studying the Apocryphal Gospels? And how does your book help them do that? Especially for the person who does not have access to the original texts in Greek, which is
Yeah.
a fair amount of study to get there. So for the layperson, how can this book really help them understand that period of time, whatever their starting perception?
Yeah. Such a great question because I think it's the point for reading every book. Why should you read it? You know, I mean, why does it matter? I think this book matters to every single person who's interested in the impact that Christianity has had on the world around it. Um, if you go to any, and I mean any of the national art museums in the Western world, you know, you're in London or Washington, D.C. or Paris, anywhere, Madrid, you are going to see a presentation of Jesus that in some ways is not going to reflect the 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 presentation of who Jesus is in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Everyone's been to an art museum and seen, uh, 12th century painting or a Renaissance painting, 16th century painting, or of a baby Jesus almost instructing people around him, or having very uh, graphic facial expressions that communicate deep emotion that, a toddler is not really doing, not communicating theological truth at 2, 3 years old. Well, the reason why that art became, why that art existed in the world at that point in history is because before that art was created, there was a series of narrative expressions that identified who Jesus was in those particular ways, and they had an influence on the world around them, especially on Catholicism. And then paintings were made. So, I mean, if you want to understand artwork at the Louvre, um, you know, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John will get you part of the way, but it will not get you all of the way. It will not get you to understand a lot of how people viewed who Jesus was. Even the idea, that we have three wise men or three magi who come to see Jesus. Well, why are there three? Well, it doesn't mention three in the Synoptic Gospels. Where does it come from? It comes from a gospel that is not in our Bibles, and they're named actually. And most plays that go on in evangelical churches that I've seen actually ascribe the names to the kings that are not found in the Bible in the New Testament, but are found in the Apocryphal Gospel. And so it has had huge influence on the world around us and on expressions of Christianity, Protestant and Catholic. And I think we need to understand it. Now, the great thing and the unique thing about this book is you don't have to spend a lot of time reading all of and there's way more than 4 Apocryphal Gospels, way more. And it would be time consuming to go and read every single one. And what we've decided to do with this book is combine as many of them as we can and create one story that gives our readers a very good understanding of what's contained in these different gospels, in these different apocryphal gospels. So you get, instead of reading 20 apocryphal gospels, you can read one. And at the footnotes throughout the book, you'll be able to identify where does this particular information come from, which apocryphal gospel, notes corresponding to events all the way through the book. And it's just really never been done. These gospels never circulated in the known world like this. Never. Great question. And I'll tell you, in the first century, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John never did as well. It's not until you get to, after the 3rd century that there's an effort to combine Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John into a record. So it's not unheard of what we've done. People have done it, very early on in the centuries following the resurrection. People combined Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John in order to compare those gospels and in order to give people a seamless understanding of what was involved in Jesus's life and ministry. This is basically the first time that's ever been done with the apocryphal gospels. Great question.
Okay, and I'm glad you mentioned the referencing, because I found the reference to the Apocryphal Gospels, where they are. That makes this a very good student's guide. You can get the overview, and then you can dig in wherever you want to. The referencing is very strong. And I say that as somebody who came in, I do read Greek, but I had spent very little time with the Apocryphal Gospels before reading this, and found that just a very, very helpful thing. So I'm saying that for the audience in here. Uh,
This is Henry. This is a book that is
Great
it is
question.
very much designed for a popular audience. Like, in other words, you don't need any seminary training in order to read. It's why that's why the title says a story. Anybody can read a story, and anybody can read this story. But I think a lot of times, for example, I mean, I went to, evangelical seminaries and for my studies, and I think we never heard about the apocryphal gospels because, you know, and not that we didn't hear, but we never really engaged them at all in my studies. A bachelor's degree, a master's degree, and even my doctorate. But we never engage them because I think you're so focused on the biblical text in those programs that you got to leave something out. You can't do everything. I really think that even though this is written for a popular audience, the referencing and the content make this a resource that goes right into a seminary curriculum, like a New Testament introduction course. Um, that students could read this in a week.
And for the scholarly side of that, I parallel this with doing a study of the Old Testament Apocrypha, where you find a lot of things that you find a lot of ideas and so on and so forth that moved, influenced later beliefs. But often, as Protestants, we don't, especially, we don't read those intervening books, and so things appear to be, they come out of thin air.
That's right.
So now assessing uh, historically, and this is really my final question on this, and specifically for you, because you would give a priority for multiple reasons to the four canonical gospels. So let me just, the standard question, I think every person who teaches Bible beyond basic Sunday school gets it. Why are there four gospels and why those four gospels?
Yeah.
If you can do that, the short version, it's a little bit like define the universe and give three examples, but
Yeah, I'll give you the short version. Literature, if you want to change the world, you have to write. And the literature, the greatest changes in the world have begun with literature. And almost immediately after the resurrection and ascension of Jesus Christ, his disciples remained in Jerusalem and they began thinking, we have to write this down. I believe Matthew was written within the first few years, written to a Jewish audience that they would have been serving until they left Jerusalem to take the gospels to take the gospel to the ends of the world. But from that moment, they began writing down a record that they could use to explain to people the significance of what Jesus did on the cross and how he was and is the one who was promised all the way back, not to Abraham, but all the way back to Adam in Genesis chapter 3, verse 15. This is the one that they've been waiting for, to use the question the disciples of John asked in Matthew 10, are you the one we've been waiting for? This is the one that all creation has been waiting for, and they wrote down a presentation of his life and his ministry that would be convincing evidence to those who didn't believe yet, and also an example of and a source of strength and wisdom and a model for what it would look like to live your life and become like Jesus in this world. And so Matthew wrote, and then Luke wrote to an audience that became more Gentile. The Gospel of Mark is Great question. 100%, in my opinion, the Gospel of Peter, even though there's an apocryphal gospel called the Gospel of Peter, that is not the same thing. I think Mark is historically connected to the Apostle Peter, and is the recollections of, the record of his messages that were delivered in Rome. And John got to the end of his life, and apparently they were already began to ask questions about the relationship between Jesus and the Father. If Jesus is, there's this one God, there is one God, and you shall have no other gods, and all of a sudden you have Jesus saying he's God, and if Jesus is God, then who's he praying to? And all of these things created an issue within local churches, starting with the church where John apparently was, and John responded to it and said, this is who Jesus is, and this is his relationship to the Father. And that's the reason why you have in the Gospel of John so many references to the Father. God so loved the world that he gave his one and only what? Son, right? John 4. The Father is searching, not God is searching those who will worship in spirit and truth. The Father is searching those who will worship in spirit and truth. And you go all the way through. It's the longest conversation between Jesus and the Father. So anyways, certain circumstances resulted in the need for 4 gospels. We didn't start with 4. If 4 gospels were required at the very beginning, they would have all been written, or there would have just been 1 gospel. But the fact that we have 4 written or connected to each one of them by 1 or more apostles is because over the course of time, there arose a need in different communities or in multiple communities of Christian faith to explain who Jesus is, what the significance of his death on the cross was, and how people could be saved. And then I think the fourth one, John, became a theological issue that arose on the relationship of Jesus to the Father. Great question.
Okay, I'm going to leave it at that. The book we're talking about, A Story of Jesus' Life Based on the Apocryphal Gospels. And as I've been listening to you, I look at my cover with all the puzzle pieces, and it'll be, I'll have that on screen about this point, and I'll point out that the puzzle pieces have pieces of actual papyri of the, I forget actually which of the Apocryphal Gospels. Obviously, I couldn't get a very solid sampling, but I was almost thinking, I should have had a few more pieces actually put together because of what the book is doing, but it's going with all of these puzzle pieces and putting it together. And so I commend the book, and I really appreciate the breadth of background and scholarship that's represented by you and Dr. Pinero together, that I think makes this valuable for people from a variety of perspectives, and to help us understand the world of the New Testament and the early church, especially. So thank you, Thomas.
Thanks so much, Henry.